Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. I know it's not the best outside, so I really appreciate those of you that made the effort. As you know, we're kind of still socially distanced, wearing our masks, so we're still doing what we've been doing for a while. Thank you. Before starting, a little housekeeping. The bathrooms are over on my right, just as you come in the doors. And there's an exit there if there's an emergency, but I guess there won't be a stampede if there is. There is also a very small, slow elevator at the back of the room if anybody needs to use the elevator. Now, after the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So in person, there are pens and paper if you want to write down a question, and then we can answer them afterwards, after the presentation. Online, there is our YouTube, and there is a chat on YouTube that you can put in, and we will have someone take your questions down. In Google Meet, there is a chat, so you click on the icon and you can ask the question direct. Now, YouTube will be available for viewing anytime afterwards, anywhere. So particularly if you don't want to have your face displayed, especially on the Google Meet where the faces go, please remember to turn off your screen, off your video, so you can still hear and see, but your face won't be shown. So that's for Google Meet. And also on Google Meet, if you would mute your mic unless you need to ask a question. Now, I would like to give a really big thank you to Santo Keenis, our youth minister here at St. Teresa, but also our tech man. And he's setting up YouTube, and he has been a tremendous help for me and a great advisor. He has, YouTube is broadcast by Shofar Studios, correct? And he's been helped by his son Joel. So I appreciate that help. I would also like to thank the Knights of Columbus, District Knight Marlon Ursuline, for offering to manage the Google Meet. And I would love to say thank you to our St. Teresa CWL President, Fern Hardy, so she will be managing the YouTube chat. And also I'd like to thank the Knights of Columbus St. Peter Council 7070 for providing the time and the muscle in setting this room up. And the Legion of Mary Paul Hanaku. I don't see him here though. So, and finally, a big thank you to Danny Hardy of Creative Communications for his wonderful contribution in the beautiful visual poster that he gave for us. So, and then I would like to thank our diocesan CWL President, Mary Malloy, who has been a great help and an advisor too. So our guest speaker is Father Philip Kruger. Reverend Father Philip Kruger is originally from Saskatchewan. Before entering the seminary, Father Philip studied law at the University of Saskatchewan, and he was called to the bar in British Columbia. He has a doctorate in canon law and a PhD from the University of Ottawa. He has studied in France and completed his seminary studies in Germany. He was ordained in Ottawa in 1998 and held the post of Seminar Rector, General Secretary of the Society of Apostolic Life, and is a sessional lecturer at Newman Theological College, and is currently a parish priest for the parishes of Assumption and Resurrection. As judicial vicar for the Archdiocese, Father Philip has specialized legal training and oversight over all canonical affairs and acts in the name of the Archbishop Richard Smith, and directs the tribunal that serves the Diocese of Edmonton, St. Paul, Gruard, McLennan, and Mackenzie Fort Smith. In his personal time, Father Philip writes fiction novels. In 2019, he published Ivan the Giant for middle school children, and which is available as an ebook. Father Philip also likes to plan garden layouts with the dream of creating botanical splendor, which can be very challenging in our wintry prairie climate. Please welcome Father Philip.
Thank you very much. I'm quite distant from everyone, so if nobody has an objection, I'm going to remove my mask. Is that all right? Thank you very much, Annette, for that introduction and for organizing this behind the scenes. And again, thank you to Santo and Marlon also for the IT component. And I think we're set to go. We had a few technical issues to the start, but I think they've been sorted out. Thank you also to St. Teresa Parish here in Edmonton for hosting this evening.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Father Patrick Basca is here, the pastor of the parish. So thank you, Father Patrick.
Father Philip, you're a very warm welcome to
Thank
St.
you.
Teresa's Parish. Thank you for coming and for presenting this very thoughtful and most important pastoral issue to the church today. We look forward to hearing good questions and responses that you can offer and guidance too for our people. Great. All right. So a very special welcome, Father Philip, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Patrick.
And welcome to you all as well. Very good. We have a few more people coming down from Mass.
Okay.
Earlier. Okay.
Oh, I forgot to say something. There were pens and paper handed out for you. If you have questions here in the room, write them down on the paper, and later on I'll come around or send somebody around and you can put your questions in the basket, or if you want to, you can come up and ask them yourself. Either way. And Father, could I ask you to say a prayer to start, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Our Lady of the Family, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Just one little technical note. I kept getting bumped out of the Google Meet program, so as we go through the slides, I will have to tell Marlon to change the slides as we go along. I don't have access to do that. To preface this talk this evening, which will probably last about 30 to 40 minutes, we're cognizant, of course, that marriage is the most common vocation to which all of us are called. And marriage, as we know, is not an easy state of life. And there are ups and downs. I, of course, am not married and have never been married, but of course I come from a family and I'm quite aware of those types of difficulties. What we're going to do this evening is to look at marriage from the canonical or legal point of view. By way of reference, the Code of Canon Law was called by John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, the last document of the Second Vatican Council. When the council first opened, the council fathers, one of the first items on the agenda was to reform the Code of Canon Law, which had been in place since 1917. And so the work of the commission that was then tasked with modifying the Code of Canon Law put all their work on hold until all of the debates and the rest of the Second Vatican Council was concluded. Once that work was done, and then the Reform Commission met over many years and getting input from all around the world, and eventually promulgated a new Code of Canon Law, which is dated now from 1983. There are constant upgrades, updates, and modifications to the law, but the body of it is from, as it currently stands, is from 1983. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Church is a universal entity in its earthly and spiritual aspects. And so the laws in the Code of Canon Law have to apply equally to Edmonton, Alberta, as well as to, say, Djibouti or South Africa. And so all of the laws and the norms in the code are meant and are quite general in some cases, because they have to apply universally to people everywhere from various cultures and backgrounds. And so that's by way of preface to the Code of Canon Law. We're just dealing with marriage from that point of view. So the Code of Canon Law tries to take what the Second Vatican Council taught on marriage and to formulate it in what we call normative language. Normative means actionable. So it's one thing to say a very nice statement, but then you have to put it into some sort of actionable form that can tell us something about expected behaviors and so on. And so the code tries to make that translation of the documents of the Second Vatican Council into normative and legal text. But underneath it is a theological understanding of the human person and our relationship with God and our vocation and our destiny, not just here below, but our supernatural destiny as well. And so this evening then I've entitled this Marriage, Divorce, and Declarations of Nullity. What is that all about? Because a lot of people have questions in our own society, as we know. There are lots of ideas about what marriage is and the effects. And so I want to come back to how the Church understands marriage and what that means for us here below and for the vocation, as I said, that is the most common vocation of all the faithful. And so I'll just ask Marlon to go to the next slide. So there's going to be 5 elements to this presentation. We'll talk about the institution of marriage, what it is, what marriage is. Secondly, we'll talk about what we call the external form or canonical form of marriage. That's how do we get into the married state, the external rites, and so on. So the institution of marriage, what it is, the form of marriage, how we become married, the freedom to marry, civil divorce, and then what we call declarations of nullity. So those are the 5 elements this evening. And I'll ask Marlon to go to the next slide. We'll talk then, first of all, about marriage as an institution. Now, institution is a bad word in our society, but it is nevertheless necessary to human society. We have all sorts of institutions in any kind of human society, in any culture, and any civilization. Marriage is one of them. I'll just ask you to go to the next slide. So what we have when we talk about marriages, just to keep in mind, we have natural marriages. We talk sometimes about Christian marriages, Catholic marriage. What's the difference between all of those? So if you can keep all of those ideas in mind as we go through, hopefully it'll filter down into more concrete things throughout the presentation. All right, next slide, please, Marian. So the nature of marriage as an institution. We can say 4 things about marriage. First of all, it's universal. Not just universal across the world as we know it today, but universal across cultures and civilizations of the past as well, whatever they may be. Marriage transcends or goes beyond any one particular culture or civilizations. However, we do know that marriage ceremonies vary widely. And emphasize that, I just put a form of marriage. I have friends who were Hindu, and this would be through one of their marriage ceremonies. Also, the other thing to note is that marriage is not a uniquely Christian institution. Marriage wasn't invented when Christ came. He didn't do that. He did something special with marriage, which we'll talk about. But marriage predates Christ, and so that's an important thing just to keep in mind. Since a marriage, secondly, we say it's natural to human beings. Since it sort of is universal, not just across cultures and civilizations in our current day, but historically as well. Marriage seems to be something that is common to all human beings. There's we say marriage is an institution of the natural law. Natural law is just kind of a word that means it's part of who we are as human beings, to have this tendency to seek out a particular kind of relationship, which has become known as marriage. And so marriage is something natural to human beings. It's inscribed in our hearts and in our minds, you might say. And so it's a natural institution that predates Christ, there from the beginning of man and woman. The third point is that the content of marriage is pretty much the same across civilizations and cultures and times. We'll talk a little bit about that because that, of course, is one of the elements that has been discussed most recently in our own culture, in our own current world. So while the content of marriage is the same, the institution, the ceremonies of a marriage rite vary, as we know, greatly from one culture to another. The other thing, and this is worth noting today in our individualistic current modern society, that marriage actually has a social dimension. Marriage is not a uniquely and entirely personal and an individual affair. Marriage has an effect upon society as a whole. In the church, we talk about it as a building block of human society. And this is recognized even in the civil laws. It's the reason why Alberta and the other provinces and other countries regulate marriage, because there's a recognition that marriage has a social impact beyond the individuals who get married. And that's important to keep in mind. It's not a private and personal thing only. So we'll move to the next slide. I think someone needs to mute their microphone, please. We can hear you speaking. So we'll just ask the person who's speaking right now to mute their microphone. Thank you. So those are some of the sort of preliminary essential things about the institution of marriage. What we say in particular and in normative or the legal language, which is translating the language of the Second Vatican Council at the bottom there, Gaudium et Spes, which is there. The Vatican document says, hence, by that human act whereby spouses mutually bestow and accept one another, so that's the I do of the marriage ceremony. I accept you and I offer myself to you. I do. By that mutually bestowing and accepting each other, a relationship arises which by divine will and in the eyes of society too is a lasting one. For the good of the spouses and their offspring, as well as of society, the existence of the sacred bond no longer depends on human decisions alone. For God himself is the author of matrimony, endowed as it is with various benefits and purposes. So we're just going to unpack that a little bit, that statement. There's a lot of words in there and phrases and what they mean. First of all, we say that marriage is natural to human beings, as we said. It's an intimate partnership of the whole of life. We bestow and accept each other, not just till death do us part, which is the temporal space of human life, but the depth of the whole human person, for better, for worse, for rich or poor, in sickness and in health, to use the traditional terms. That partnership of the whole of life, not just spatially, till death do us part, but I accept and I give all of myself to the other person. Not a part of me, but all of me, to use the words of a popular song. We give all of ourselves to the other person. So it's an intimate partnership of the whole of life. There's no aspect of a human life which is not involved in marriage. We say that it's established by the Creator. So the Second Vatican Council talked about God as the author of marriage. using also the wording from in the church before. Established by the Creator, this simply means, it means that it's marriage as an institution, this natural tendency to this type of relationship is embedded in human activity, in the human being and the human person. And so in that sense, because God is the author of creation and we're part of creation, we are creatures with that inborn tendency within us, in that sense we can speak of God as being the author of marriage. It's rooted in a conjugal covenant and a contract. And so across civil societies and cultures and civilizations, marriage has always been viewed as a contract. That's the I do exchange. I consent to you, and you consent to me. To use an analogy from your everyday life, a contract, when you go, for instance, to Walmart and you want to buy that T-shirt there, you go up to the cashier and you say, I want to buy this T-shirt, and the cashier essentially says, I want to sell it to you. There's an I do at that point at the Walmart. And that's the essential nature of a contract in civil law. As soon as there's the meeting of the two consents, that forms the contract. And we see that in marriage as well, and in the form of marriage as well, by the very wording that we use. So there's a mutual exchange of consent, which is a contractual relationship. But of course, marriage is not like buying a T-shirt at Walmart. Marriage involves not a one-off transaction, but the partnership for the whole of life. So it's a unique kind of contract that involves the whole person. And so there's a contractual element to it, but it also it continues. And so there's an element of covenant. And covenant was particularly chosen because covenant is the biblical language of the relationship between God and his chosen people that continues and endures through all time. And so the word covenant then gets at this idea that the marriage contract is a very unique type of contract. It also has a sacred aspect. So in the Second Vatican Council, they talked about marriage as a sacred bond, and it's called a sacred bond, even if it's if it's between two non-baptized people, it's still a sacred bond. Why? Because it gets back to this idea that God is the author of marriage, and so there's a sacred aspect to it, which most cultures and civilizations have recognized. Then we say that it's a covenant and a contract, and of its nature is ordered to the good of the spouses and the procreation and upbringing of children. So this is one of the unique aspects also of the relationship. The entire good of the individual person is involved in marriage. Each of the spouses is responsible for the welfare, the entire welfare, the good of the other person. And so marriage is about building up the human person within that very unique, special relationship, and which is tied also at the same time to the openness to having children, procreation, and then not just having children, but then the obligations and the rights to bring them up. And so those are some of the unique aspects of what marriage has always been considered as an institution across time and civilization. In our own day, of course, that's one of the essential elements which is more under question. Arising through an irrevocable personal covenant. So this is the hard part, the irrevocable personal covenant, consent. So when I say I do, I set up a unique relationship between myself and the other person that involves the whole of me and the whole of the other person. It involves my own welfare and the welfare of the other person, and the possibility also of the expression of the love between the two spouses, which is manifested in the openness to having children. But it's irrevocable. It cannot be withdrawn. You can take your T-shirt back and ask for a refund, but you can't ask for a refund on your spouse, put it that way. And then arising between two baptized persons, then, and only between two baptized persons, is marriage a sacrament. If one of the persons in the marriage is unbaptized, it's not a sacrament. It's still a sacred bond, but it's not a sacrament. A sacramental arises, and that's the unique aspect of a Christian marriage, is that both parties are baptized. And because of their baptism, Christ then has raised that particular marriage to the form of a sacrament. But between two atheists, between two Hindus, like my friends, it's still a sacred bond, but it's not a sacrament. Next slide. So given that background of what marriage is and what it has been across time and civilizations and cultures, we can say that there are two what we call essential properties of marriage: unity or faithfulness, and indissolubility. It can't be broken by any human power. And those are essential properties of marriage. They're not external to the marriage. They are of the very heart and essence of the marriage. Unity, faithfulness or fidelity, and indissolubility. Next slide. As the nature of marriage itself is embedded in the human being, and so this phrase is of natural law, the church even is not free to alter what marriage is. It can merely determine what and explain what marriage is and put it into normative language. And the church can try and determine if the two people who are presenting themselves to be married are truly posing a free act of consent and have the intention to enter marriage as it is. But even the church is not free to define what marriage is. The church will put it into normative language to give the elements of it, but the church, by doing that, is not defining it. God is the author of marriage. So not any ecclesiastical authority, not any human authority in the understanding of the church. No human authority or ecclesiastical authority can define what marriage is. God has made it what it is. It's kind of a package deal. I consent to it. Or not. But if I don't consent to all of the elements of what marriage is, it's simply not a marriage. It's something else. We have many varieties of human relationships and human affections in our lives. Marriage is one of them. And there can be other forms of affection and long-term forms of affection which are not marriage, but which are obviously important in our lives. So, next slide, please. So, we've just talked very briefly about the heart of marriage, what marriage is as an institution, the package of marriage. When I say I do, this is what I'm consenting to. And then we'll start talking in a moment then about the formalities. How do I get into the married state? So, on the one hand, the institution of marriage, as I've tried to explain in the view of the church, marriage is a natural institution. The content of marriage is not changeable. The author is God, to use the phrase in the church. However, human law can determine how we get into the married state. And we call that the external form or the rite of marriage. And that can be regulated by human authority, civil and ecclesiastical. And also the form of the marriage can be imposed for a validity of the marriage. So what that means is that in order to enter a valid marriage, I have to go through some external formalities. And if I don't observe those formalities, the marriage is not valid. It's not recognized at law. And this is as true of the civil law as of the church law, of the canon law. So in Alberta, if you want to enter the marriage state in Alberta, you can't just go up to the person you want to marry and say, I do. The province of Alberta requires external forms. It requires a marriage license by the two parties. It requires that the be some public form of celebration that is done in front of a licensed minister as well. And if any of those external formalities are not observed, or there's a defect in them, then that's not a valid marriage in the view of the civil society. And so the form of marriage, although it's something that can be regulated and defined by human authority and can be for validity, it is important in order to enter into the state of marriage. And that's recognized again by civil authorities. And it's one of the indications, again, that civil authorities recognize that marriage is not simply a personal and private matter. It has a social dimension that's important enough that the civil society wants to regulate it, and regulate it even in the sense of how a person gets into the state of marriage. Next slide. So the current challenges, of course, that we have in the church that we're faced with, and this has been noted by the three previous popes, and most particularly by Pope Francis, is this, that the level of catechesis of the average Catholic today is considered to be very low. And so Pope Francis and the two previous popes have talked about marriage preparation courses as having to take on the flavor of almost a quasi-catechumenate. That the people coming in who are presenting themselves for marriage have such a low understanding of what we believe, that marriage preparation courses need to take those couples where they're at and try to bring them along and give them a fuller formation. I think it's also fair to say that for most of us in our current civil society, religion is considered a personal, a private matter, and doesn't have much room in the public space. Also, that view has penetrated with baptized Catholics as well. So they consider the practice of their faith to be a very purely private and personal matter. And so when a couple is presenting themselves for marriage and the church says, well, this is what you have to do in order to get married and have it recognized in the church, most probably Catholics aren't really prepared for that. They don't understand why the church is requiring all of these formalities and all of this. And so it's a difficult moment. It's a difficult moment when people come to prepare for marriage, and it's for the first time they're confronted with the fact that their faith actually makes demands of them. And I would think overall we're not terribly prepared for that confrontation. Next slide. So I just want to talk about these external forms of marriage in the Catholic Church, what we call canonical form, how I get into the married state. Next slide. So we're going to look at several scenarios when at least one party is Catholic. So they could be marrying a baptized, say, Anglican. They could be marrying a Jewish person or an atheist. But if one of the parties is Catholic, the Catholic party, by their baptism, is going to be obliged to follow the external rites required by the church. And the formalities for the marriage to be valid and recognized in the church is that it must be before a delegated minister. It could be a priest or a deacon or a lay person in some places. And that person, who's the qualified minister, he's like the equivalent of the licensed minister of marriages for the province of Alberta. But in the church, that person, called the qualified witness, receives the consent of the two parties in the name of the church. And that's important because the exchange of consent, the I do, in front of someone who is receiving it in the name of the whole church, emphasizes the societal dimension of marriage, that it's not a purely private affair. And it has to be also done in the presence of two witnesses. So those are usually the best man and the maid of honor. And so there have to be two witnesses. If one of the parties getting married has only one witness curiously, that marriage will be invalid. All right, and that's a purely external reason for the invalidity of the marriage, because the Church's Code of Canon Law has required that there be 2 witnesses, and the 2 witnesses are required for that marriage to be valid. Now, there are historical reasons for that. The whole reason why the form of marriage in the Catholic Church is quite visible and structured is because in the past there were what they called secret or clandestine marriages. And at the end of the day, people didn't know who was married to whom. And so you can imagine for the question of legitimacy of children, which was important at that time, or even if you wanted to know if you're related to the person later on that you get married. If you couldn't actually trace who was married to whom, it could be very difficult. You could be marrying a first cousin or a step brother or something, or a half brother or something like that. And so the Church back in the 1500s said, all right, that's enough. We're going to have a strong external form. And so that's why there are 2 witnesses. There has to be a qualified minister there as well. In the Church, there's the Western Church or the Latin Church, the Roman Church, and there are the Eastern churches like the Eastern or the Ukrainian Catholic churches, the Maronite, Syro-Malabar. There's 26 Eastern Catholic churches, and they have a slightly different form. I'm not going to go into the details of that. If someone has a question, I can answer. Next slide. So common issues. So we looked at where at least one party is Catholic. What about marriages where there's 2 non-Catholics? What about 2 marriage ceremonies? So this is very common. They say, okay, I got to get married in the church, but I want to get married on the beach in Mexico. That's where I want the marriage to be. How do we deal with that? And what about outdoor weddings? We'll go through those. The next slide. So again, where one of the parties is Catholic, actually, we just sort of looked at that, where there has to be canonical form. And we looked at that. So a qualified witness, a priest or a deacon or a layperson who's been delegated to witness marriages between 2 witnesses, with 2 witnesses present. Next slide. So that's one party is Catholic. Obviously, if both are Catholic, it's the same thing. What about marriages between 2 non-Catholics? So we have different constellations of marriages here. Marriages, say, between 2 baptized non-Catholics, so between a Lutheran and an Anglican. What about marriage between 2 atheists? Or what about marriages between 2 unbaptized persons? And so the way that the Church looks at it is, if, let's say, an Anglican marries another Anglican, the Catholic Church will recognize whatever is the external form that the Anglicans recognize. So, for instance, in the Anglican Church, it's possible for Anglicans to be married before a justice of the peace. And the Anglican Church will recognize that as a valid marriage. So the Catholic Church says they're Anglican. The Anglican Church has recognized that. So, of course, we recognize that if an Anglican person, two Anglicans get married in front of a justice of peace, that's a valid marriage. If the Anglican marries a Catholic, it's not going to work because the Catholic is obliged to the canonical form before qualified witness. 2 atheists, 2 unbaptized persons, then they get married in a civil ceremony. And because marriage is of the natural law, and it's a natural institution, the Catholic Church, the 2 unbaptized persons who are atheists, if they get married in a civil ceremony, that's a valid marriage. There's not a problem with that. Right? Or if there are 2 unbaptized persons, like my friends who were 2 Hindus and they got married together by their religion required, then that's a valid marriage. The Catholic Church will recognize that also as a valid marriage. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding. People tend to think that anyone who gets married outside the church, that's not a valid marriage or something like that. No. We follow the faith traditions of the other persons who are married, and we'll recognize the validity if that faith community whatever that faith community accepts as a valid form of marriage, Catholic Church accepts it as well. Next slide. So 2 marriage ceremonies. So we have sometimes, we say, well, we want I'm Catholic, so I want the marriage. I want a little ceremony in the Catholic Church, but I want the big ceremony in the Anglican Church, say. The basic principle is there can be only one exchange of consent. There can't be 2 marriages. You're either married or you're not. So basically the church says, we'll choose one of those. All right, if you're a Catholic party, you have to observe canonical form, but you can get dispensed from it if there are reasons why, for instance, your Anglican fiancé has an attachment to their faith community where they are, or very often they may be related to the Anglican minister. And so it's possible for the Catholic Church to give the Catholic party a dispensation from the formalities to get married in the Anglican Church. But if there is no dispensation, that marriage would be considered invalid, all right? Because the Catholic party is obliged to the canonical form. They can be dispensed from it, but in the absence of a dispensation, they would not be considered married. Question of destination marriages. No one's, what we try to do is we try to have the Catholic ceremony first. Usually it's as the Catholic wedding, and we would consider the sort of destination wedding as a renewal of vows. But the actual marriage ceremony, the valid marriage ceremony, would be the one in the church for the Catholic party. All right. So if the Catholic party simply gets married on the beach in Mexico, and there's no Catholic ceremony at any other time, that would not be considered a valid marriage. Again, because the formalities require the marriage to be in front of a qualified minister. Next slide. Oftentimes we get requests for outdoor weddings. I want to get married in the park. In the Catholic Church, most dioceses do not permit outdoor weddings because of the societal dimension, because also of the dimension of the covenant and the relationship to the broader Christian community. The church wants that marriage to be in a religious setting. And so the church wants it to be in the parish church of the Catholic party. There can be an exception, so you can get a dispensation from it, but there would have to be supporting reasons. Another example, just to give you, so a Catholic party wants to marry a practicing Jewish person, and so they would like to get married according in the Jewish tradition. They can get married before a justice of the peace. It's possible for the diocese to give a dispensation to the Catholic party so that they can get married before a justice of the peace. Not forcing the Jewish person to follow always the Catholic form. Next slide. I want to just briefly talk about candidates for RCIA. So unbaptized persons who are in the process of becoming baptized Catholics and going through the RCIA program, where they've been previously married and divorced. So generally speaking, in the church, we want that original marriage of that person to be examined to see if it was valid or not before proceeding to baptize them. The reason for that is we don't want, when the person is baptized, to put them in an awkward situation where the faith that they're embracing through their baptism is contradicted by some state of life that they were in previously. And so we try to deal with the question of their previous marriages first before proceeding to their baptism. I don't know if that makes much sense, but those of you who are involved with RCIA programs, it is quite critical to know if they were previously married and divorced and are in another marriage, or even if they're not, to try and get that matter regulated, determined one way or another, so that they can truly freely be baptized, knowing their state of life in terms of their previous marriage. All right, next slide. So we've looked at the institution of marriage. We've looked at the external form by which we become marriage and some of the corresponding complications that can arise. I just want to come back then to the question of one's freedom to enter into marriage. Next slide, please. One of the whole purposes of the marriage preparation and the original interviews with the couple is to determine if they're making a free, mature choice to enter marriage. And so we want to make sure that they're making a commitment freely. And there's two aspects to freedom. There's a psychological freedom. Am I mature enough to make this irrevocable kind of consent? And that's a difficult question. So there's psychological freedom. Am I able to commit to this type of relationship, which we call marriage? Secondly, there's a legal freedom. There are legal reasons why two people may not be able to marry, and that's in the civil law as well as in canon law. To use a very example, a father cannot marry his daughter. That's a legal impediment to getting married, both in the civil law and in the Code of Canon Law, which it would go against what we call divine law. Next slide. So some things to watch out for psychological freedom. So oftentimes couples have been cohabiting now. That's very common, as we know. So one has to be careful, because once a couple has intertwined their finances and their lives for a considerable period of time, perhaps have children, the question arises, are they actually making a free choice? Are they able to back out of that relationship? And so that is a key question when looking at couples who have been cohabitating for a long time. Are you really making a free decision? Sometimes what happens is the couple's in trouble. And the Catholic party says, we're in trouble because we didn't get married in the church and we don't have this sacrament. So we'll just get married in the church and then everything will be all right. It's like, no. You need to sort out the relationship first. And so, there's no silver bullet in that sense. Also, less so, but in some cultures still, if there's a pregnancy, there'll be an awful lot of pressure for the couple to marry. And so one has to be wary of that. Financial dependency. There could be also psychological things like a codependency, personality, and so on. Social pressure from parents or cultural factors. Less so in our culture here in Canada, but those are still very strong social pressures that can mitigate one's freedom psychologically to enter marriage in certain cultures. So there's psychological freedom. So we try to determine that they're making a free, mature choice in the circumstances of their lives. Legal freedom then comes down to, is there any kind of legal impediment to having them married, such as their biological relationship? Next slide. So there are specific legal impediments to two people getting married in certain circumstances. These are often in the civil law, but they're also in the church's law. So you have to be of a certain age. In Canada, you have to be a minimum of 18. In the Code of Canon Law, women have to be 14 and men have to be 16. And again, that's because the Code of Canon Law applies not just to the Canadian experience, but to the experience of the church in other cultures and other countries. Impotence is also a legal impediment. Prior bond, or if you've been married before and divorced without declaration of invalidity, which we'll talk about later. Marrying an unbaptized person in the church is a legal impediment. It can be dispensed from and is routinely dispensed from, but it is a legal impediment. A baptized Catholic is not permitted to marry an unbaptized person unless they receive a dispensation from the bishop. Sacred orders or religious vows, so I'm in a holy order, so that's a legal impediment. I can't get married, or a person who has taken their definitive vows in a religious institute. Here's a funny one, but again, a lot of these are from the history of the church and which do exist. Someone who kidnaps another person in order to get married, or someone who murders an existing spouse so that person will be free to marry. That would be a legal impediment. Some blood relationships, so father, daughter, up to first cousins, basically. Some in-law relationships, I won't go into that. Legal adoption, so we have two people who are not related by blood, but they're legally adopted into the same family. That's a legal impediment. Why? Because everybody knew them growing up as brother and sister, right? And so it can be dispensed from. It's not of divine law, but it's on the face of it, one, that is an impediment. For Eastern Catholics, so for example, Eastern Ukrainians, a person cannot marry their godparent from baptism. All right, that used to be in the Western Church. It's not anymore, but it is still in the Eastern Church. All right, we'll just move then to civil divorce. What's that about? And then finally talk about declarations of nullity. So civil divorce law claims to dissolve an existing marriage bond. Oh, go to the next slide, please. So claims to dissolve an existing marriage bond and so declare the parties free to marry again. And so next slide, please. So let's try and understand what's going on here. So again, we come back to the idea that the church, even the church, does not get to define what marriage is. The church gets to recognize what marriage is and to put that into normative language, but it doesn't get to change what marriage is. And so the church does recognize that there are situations when a married couple can no longer live together, threats to life or to children or all kinds of reasons. But the church is very firm on asserting that marriage is not dissoluble. Once a marriage bond, particularly a sacramental bond of marriage, arises, that is indissoluble. It cannot be dissolved by any human authority. And of course, that can be very distressing for people and so on. And so the church says that the civil authorities do not have the ability to dissolve marriages because of what marriage is. And so the civil law of divorce does not make a party free to marry. And that's equally true whether it's two Hindus got married, two Anglicans got married, two Catholics got married, two atheists got married, because of what marriage is as an institution. And so oftentimes we'll hear, I want to marry a Lutheran, but he's Lutheran and he got married from his previous spouse. He's not Catholic, so he got a civil divorce, so he should be free to marry. No. Because of what marriage is, if the Lutheran was in a valid marriage, that cannot be broken. It's as indissoluble as another one. And so there's confusion about that. I must say that even amongst the priests, okay, that they think that, well, if they weren't Catholic and they get a civil divorce, then they're free to marry. No. Marriage is what it is, as we said at the beginning, whether you are baptized or unbaptized. And there's no way to change that. Next slide. Next slide. I put him to sleep. So declarations of nullity. What's the difference? Where is he here? Okay. So the church says marriages are not dissoluble. These sacramental marriages are not dissoluble. So when the church issues a declaration of nullity, it's not making a valid marriage invalid. What it is it's trying to make a determination that there was something absent on the day of the wedding, such that the marriage is no longer, it was never valid from the beginning. So to go back to my example, if there was only one witness at a marriage involving a Catholic party, for an external reason, that marriage would be invalid because the Code of Canon Law requires for validity for a Catholic party that there be 2 witnesses. All right. Similarly, then we come into the other less, you don't get off on a technicality, you have to go into full investigation. What was my state of mind at the time? What was my ability to consent to marriage with this person at that time? You can think of it this way. I think most people, when they get married, they understand in an abstract way what marriage is. They want marriage as we read about it in the fairy tales, till death do us part and all that. That's what they understand as marriage. That's what they'd like to have. But it's one thing to understand marriage in the abstract level. But on the day of the wedding, with the persons involved, can I take that abstract knowledge and bring it down to a concrete I do to this particular person on this day, given that person, given my own psychological state? And so the investigation into the declaration of nullity will often be about determining if the person was able to, despite the abstract knowledge, make a critical evaluation about what they were doing on the day of the wedding. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, all right? And in no way would anybody say that a determination by a marriage tribunal is an infallible decision, all right? We have imperfect information. 75% of the time, the other party doesn't even want to be involved in the process. So we only get essentially one side of the story. But nevertheless, if a determination was made, because we live in an imperfect world, the people have a right to rely on that determination. And so what the church is doing is trying to make a determination on the day of the wedding. Was that person able to make consent, make a mature consent as required by marriage? So next slide. So to put it in another way, when people talk about divorce, they talk about the time when the relationship broke down. And that's perfectly understandable because that's the psychological trauma. Everything that led up to the breakdown of the relationship. And so that's the focus of divorce. The focus of an investigation into the validity or invalidity of a marriage is different. We're not looking at the day of the breakdown of the relationship. We're looking at the day when the relationship was supposedly made. Now, sometimes the events that go on and on and on that trigger and cause the breakdown could be present in some form on the day of the wedding. And so there's a causal link to the day of the wedding and the psychological state of mind of the person of that day. All right? Someone who has problems being faithful in the relationship. And there was a pattern even in the time of dating or in the time of the engagement, and then also subsequently after the marriage, there was infidelity. There could be a pattern that could indicate that that person has a problem making the kind of commitment necessary and the faithfulness that's involved in marriage. And so the acts before and after the actual date of the marriage, although they happen not on the day of the wedding, they do indicate something in that person's mind that they're struggling with, that may make it not possible for them on the day of their wedding to make that commitment. Years later, that can change, but on the day of the wedding, those things can be looked at. All right, and next, final slide. I think I've talked way too long here. So we have what we call lack of form cases, and we have judicial process cases. So we have the full-on investigation into what the state of mind of the parties was at the time of the wedding. That's trying to determine if they could make, for instance, a proper, mature type of decision to enter marriage. But we also have lack of form cases where some element that's required in the formalities is lacking. So if, for instance, you can show that there was only one witness, then all you need to show is that there's a document showing there was only one witness on that day. We don't need to interview everybody. because that external requirement is also required for validity. So there are two different types of investigations into validity of marriage. The sort of straightforward ones, say someone as a baptized Catholic and they got married outside the church without a dispensation of some form. Then we just need the documentation to show that they never got married in the church, that they were a baptized Catholic on the day of the wedding. They didn't follow the canonical form. Canonical form is required for validity, therefore the marriage is invalid. So it's paperwork to show that. The other one is the full-on judicial process where the parties are interviewed to determine if, on some legal grounds, the marriage is determined to be invalid. All right, next slide. So I know that's an awful lot of information. I'm not sure if it's answered maybe some of the questions that were in your mind before you sat down this evening or not. It's a lot to take in, but I will be open to any questions or clarifications if there's I'm sure there are things that in the presentation weren't entirely clear. I've been doing this for quite a few years now, and I can say when I first started, it wasn't that clear to me either, but as we go through it, it becomes clear. I think the essential thing to keep in mind on the one hand is that we understand marriage as an institution that is something embedded in human nature that is not capable of definition either by church authority or by human authority, and that's very hard for people today to grasp. And so that's...
Is this a mic on? Right. Okay, what I thought we would do is that we would take questions from the floor first, and then we could go to the YouTube chat, and then we could go to the Google and just sort of alternate like that. First of all, is there anybody on the floor who wants to come up and ask the question direct? Okay, so sir, do you want to come up then? You can ask your question. I will go around with the basket, and if somebody just wants to put their question in, we can ask.
Okay. I guess it's the language that the church uses. And when we hear the word, the marriage is not valid, and I've heard you say that doesn't mean the marriage doesn't exist between two people, because it's defined by God and by us. Am I right?
Yes. When we say that marriage is invalid, that's not to say that there wasn't a relationship of some sort. And it's also not to say that the parties weren't in good faith in going into that relationship. Those are different things. What we're talking about in this evening is simply the legal question, the canonical question of whether that was a valid marriage or not. And if it was an invalid marriage, then there was no marriage relationship. The parties may have been in good faith, and they had a relationship of affection of some sort, but it was not a marriage relationship.
Okay, my supplemental question is, the reason we want, as Catholics, to have a sacramental valid marriage is because we believe that God is present in a special way in that relationship.
Correct.
Even though canonically we may say it's not valid, doesn't mean God is gone anymore.
No,
Am I right?
That's correct. So to go back to sort of sacramental theology, so again, the point is the only marriages that would be considered sacramental are marriages between two baptized persons. So there could be two baptized Anglicans, there could be a baptized Catholic and a baptized Lutheran, but if both of the parties to the marriage are baptized, then that marriage is a sacrament. If at least one of the parties is not baptized, it's not a sacrament. It is, however, a sacred bond. It's a natural marriage, right, but it's not a sacramental marriage. Now, our understanding of the sacrament is that Christ works through that sacrament, and particularly, as St. Paul says, marriage in this life is kind of the image of the love between God and his chosen people. And so the vocation of Christian marriage between two baptized persons is to reflect in a human way that divine love between God and his people. And that's the vocation of Christian marriage.
Yeah, another one. I really love Pope Francis. Is it The Joy of Love? I can't remember the
Yes.
Latin word. That chapter 6, where he says we have to be much more pastoral, and where we have to help Christians make this formation of conscience in terms of what they're dealing in their real life, despite what the law says. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, absolutely. So what I've been talking about this evening, of course, as I said at the beginning, we're looking at marriage from the canonical or the legal point of view. Now, we're human beings, and we're more than law. And our Lord, of course, said, laws are for human people, or human beings, not human beings for laws. Nevertheless, when we understand that marriage as an institution is from God, we have to keep that in mind as well. God's grace works in many ways, but the sacraments for a baptized person are the principal means of grace for a baptized person. They're the principal means by which Christ works his grace. And so if we ignore the sacraments, the sacramental order that Christ has instituted, that could be presumption on our part. Yes, God can work apart from the sacraments. That's always possible. But to presume that God will work apart from the sacraments is problematical. I just want to preface that. In Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, chapter 6, yes, and this is a point I emphasize to the parish priests and the diocese as well. Just because there may, at the end of the day, not be a legal solution, if you will, to the relationship between two people, that doesn't mean they're not part of the church. That doesn't mean that there isn't a pastoral accompaniment that needs to go along with that. Now, Pope Francis was more explicit. He talked about the need, obviously, to welcome people, but after welcoming them, the need to discern with the couple their particular state in life, to accompany them, and to integrate them back into the Christian life. Now, integration doesn't mean everybody is integrated in the same degree. It doesn't mean you come back to all the sacraments at the same time. That also wouldn't be very respectful of a person who has not yet discerned that's where they want to be. And so the pastoral approach is to welcome them, to help discern them, with them, where they want to be in relationship to the church, to accompany them, and then to find out what degree of integration that person is able to embrace at that moment, that respects where they're at, and also what God has also created. The respect has to go on both sides. And I think we need to be mindful of that. So the pastoral problem is, the pastoral accompaniment is the bigger issue. I'm dealing with the legal aspect, but you're absolutely right. Just because, for instance, the tribunal comes and says, sorry, that was a valid marriage, doesn't mean the person isn't welcome. It doesn't mean the person shouldn't be accompanied, to continue discerning where they're at and to be integrated into the community in whatever way is possible at that time.
Okay, so you brought up a lot of interesting thoughts through my head. How can I find out if my spouse was baptized? He was born in a small town in Saskatchewan, and both of his parents have passed away now, so he doesn't know. And then the second part is, I married that guy, and we got married in St. Albert in the Grotto, so I believe that's considered part of the church.
Yes.
Okay, good. Because I'm kind of wanting to know if it's a sacramental marriage or just a natural marriage.
I don't know. The first place to go would be to check with the marriage register at St. Albert. It will indicate.
Okay.
on there, first of all, whether whether there was a dispensation given to marry someone who was unbaptized.
Okay.
So that will indicate that. The second thing that they will have in their archives at St. Albert Parish is all the marriage preparation documents.
Okay, we did take the marriage prep course.
Yeah, and so they will have done an investigation to whether he was baptized or not. So you can ask them if they have that. Was he also Catholic, or was he a...
He's never been a... No,
Nothing.
like I just always say my spouse is not Catholic.
Yeah, just a little note on baptism registers, because in the Catholic Church they're very critical. It's on your baptism register that all of the critical moments are recorded of what we call your state of life. And so your baptism obviously is in your baptismal register. Your confirmation should be in there.
Yeah, he had no other sacraments.
Your marriage will have to be entered on your baptismal register, yours.
Okay.
If there was a declaration of nullity, that will be entered on your baptismal register as well. So in the Catholic Church, the baptismal register is the document in the parish where you were baptized that has all of that information.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so now if Marlon on Google Meet has any questions?
Hi, Annette. Thank you. I have collected quite a few questions via Google Meet, so I can start with the first one.
Yeah.
First question was, does a Roman Catholic couple have to be married in a Roman Catholic church for the marriage to be valid? That's the first
The
one.
answer is no. What's essential is that if they're two Catholics, baptized Latin Catholics, that they be married before a qualified minister with two witnesses. So it's normally it's preferred. The Code of Canon Law states that it should be in the parish church of one of the two, but it is possible to be married somewhere else. And there could be various reasons for that. They could be living in an isolated community where there isn't a Catholic church, or some other reason. So the actual physical building is not required for the validity of the marriage. They should be married in the parish church of one of them, but that's not required for validity.
Thank you, Father. Second question is, explain why impotence is a legal impediment and not sterility.
The integrated purpose or ends of marriage are the good of the spouses and the procreation and upbringing of children. And those are seen as one unified purpose to marriage. You can't separate out those two. So the definition of impotence is that one person is unable to perform the sexual act. For one reason or another. It could be for physical reasons. It could also be psychological reasons. So the definition of impotence is the person is unable to perform the sexual act. Sterility is that act can be performed, but the generative processes are, we would say, disturbed. There's a good canonical word for you. And so although the act can be there, the processes are disturbed and they can't come to fruition. Whereas impotence, the person's not able to perform the act. And so because of the integrated nature of relationship to procreation and upbringing of children, impotence is considered an impediment. Now, there's lots of more that can be said on that, but that's the essential part of it. And of course, that can be a very great cross for someone in their particular state.
Okay, thank you, Father. Now I'll take a question from the floor. Are there any monetary costs for an annulment? There's two questions. And the other was, what if the other party is no longer interested in dealing with the person that wants an annulment, or if that person is not available?
Good questions. No, there is no longer any fee for an investigation into the validity of a marriage. People are invited to make a donation, but there is no fee for that. So that's the short answer. Second, there used to be in the past. I think people knew that, but there is no longer. The second question was, sorry. Oh, yes, that, yeah, this happens very frequently, that one party is interested in having the church, the tribunal, look into their previous marriage, and the former spouse has absolutely no interest in it. And I would say 75% of the cases are where only one party is involved. So where the only one party is involved, all of those cases would normally involve witnesses, people who knew the person during their dating period, during the engagement, the early years of their marriage, to help provide some further information. So it's if the other person wants nothing to do with the process, they always have the right to participate. They always have to be contacted. It's not possible to undertake an investigation into marriage where we don't contact the other person. And that can be very difficult where there have been lots of violence in a relationship. But the reason for that is everybody has a right to defense. That's a natural right. And no one can take that away. And so the tribunal cannot not contact the other party. But very frequently the other party either says, they'll tick off a box, yes, I agree to it, or they just say, go ahead, I'm not interested. If we're not able to locate them, that's another issue. We try different methods to locate the other person because they have a right to be contacted. But there are situations where that person is no longer contactable. And you can imagine, I mean, the cases can be quite complex because the parties could have been married in other countries. So it can be very, very difficult right now, for instance, to contact or to get information in Sudan, where there was a civil war. We have contacts there, but these are very real problems because people are not, we think of everybody getting married here in Edmonton, but the cases we deal with, it could be in China, it could be in many different countries.
So we have a question from online, and it's quite, she's been chatting a lot, so okay. It's quite lengthy here. Where does this leave me in my situation? I married a man that she's not sure if he was baptized or not, and he was not practicing any faith. He was abusive, committed adultery before and after. I divorced him because it was unsafe. He remarried, not a sacramental, and he's not baptized. Oh, there she goes again. So I can never remarry. Let's see. There.
Yeah. So there's always a presumption that people intend to do what they're doing. So there's always a presumption that when somebody goes through an external rite of marriage, that they intend to get married. So that's the starting point. There's a presumption that the marriage was valid. So in the tribunal, what we're trying to do is to see if there are legal reasons why that presumption can be overturned. And they have to be legal reasons that are recognized in the law. Some form of maturity and so on is required. So the number of questions were raised in that scenario. So it sounds like the other person was unbaptized. And so I'm not clear if you were married in the Catholic Church or not. So if you were a baptized Catholic and at the time of the marriage you married outside the Catholic Church, that would be a simple, fairly straightforward, what we call a documentary process, the one because there's a formality, the canonical form was absent. But if you were married in the church, then presumably there was dispensation to marry someone who was not baptized, as the former example as well. So what would have to happen is that there would have to be an investigation into that previous marriage to determine if it was valid, if the presumption in favor of the marriage bond can be overturned. And failing that, then no, the person is not free to marry because there's a prior bond involved. So the civil divorce doesn't make a person free to marry. And so there has to be a determination by the marriage tribunal whether that marriage was valid or not.
Okay, thank you. See, now I can ask Marlon on Google Meet to ask his question.
Yeah, I have a third question here. When speaking about marrying an unbaptized person, you included a note that said marrying a baptized non-Catholic requires a permission, but not a dispensation.
Right. Yeah,
You said it differently. You said that the dispensation can be given. So what's the difference between a permission and a dispensation? Thank you, Fred.
Excellent question, and there's a budding canonist there. So I didn't address one question, and so I will do that now to make this point clear. So there's a distinction between a dispensation and a permission. Those are two different things. A dispensation is required when there is an impediment, a legal impediment to getting married. And so the example would be, according to the Church's law, as you mentioned, a baptized Catholic cannot marry an unbaptized person. Now, that's not of divine law, as I mentioned. That's purely in the Church's human law. And so it can be dispensed from. And the ecclesiastical authority can do that. An application is made, simple reasons are given, and then it's considered, and the dispensation is given to marry an unbaptized person, and that's done regularly. A dispensation cannot be given for an impediment of the divine law, we would say, a divine law or natural law. So to give you an example there, a very simple example, a father cannot marry his daughter. All right, that's a legal impediment to marriage, but that's of natural law, divine law. And so no one can give a dispensation. There's no one who can make it permissible for the father to marry the daughter, not in civil law and not in canon law, because that's of divine law. So that's a dispensation. A permission is something else. So the situation is this: I'm a baptized Catholic and I want to marry a baptized Anglican. There's no impediment for that, all right? I am free as a baptized Catholic to marry a baptized Anglican, but I need permission to do that. So the marriage will be valid even if I don't get the permission, because it's not a dispensation that's required. It's not a legal impediment to the marriage. Having said that, the canonical form is required. So if I, as a baptized Catholic, want to marry a baptized Anglican, I need a permission from the ecclesiastical authority, but not a dispensation. And if I don't get the permission, it would nevertheless be valid. But I'm also required to follow canonical form. So if I get married to the Anglican person in the Anglican Church without a dispensation from canonical form, that's an invalid marriage. So the canonical form, again, is being married before a qualified witness, the priest, a deacon, or layperson who's been delegated by the Church to receive the consent in the name of the Church and with two witnesses. So there's two things going on if I, as a baptized Catholic, want to marry a baptized non-Catholic, a baptized Anglican, say. I need a permission, which is a soft form of a dispensation, but doesn't affect the validity of the marriage. But I also need a dispensation from canonical form to get married in the Anglican Church. And without that dispensation from canonical form, the marriage would still be invalid. I hope that makes...
Does that answer the question?
No.
Okay, I have two questions here that are sort of related from two different places, but I thought I'd combine them. So one is that if one party finds out after the wedding that the other party was not honest about what he claimed about himself, is that marriage valid? The next question kind of is sort of that way. It says, can annulments be granted when one spouse finally understands that he is gay?
the question of what they lied, again, we go to the presumption that the marriage is valid. There are indications where someone falsely represents who they are, which would be grounds for basically a misrepresentation that so affects the relationship that it would be considered invalid. But more typically, that particular form of a lie, it would be, one could do an investigation into the validity of the marriage to see if it's sort of, to borrow from medical terminology, whether it's symptomatic of some deeper trait in that person that on the day of the wedding made it not possible for them to commit to what we understand marriage to be. So it can be relevant to the investigation if someone lies about themselves in a serious manner, particularly if there's a repeated pattern of lying and misrepresenting oneself. We do encounter this in certain cultures where someone and in some cultures, it's important to marry someone who is a virgin, and someone will misrepresent themselves as that, and that will be a serious problem in that culture for that person. So that can, but that usually also, that can be looked at. It's not a grounds in itself for a declaration of invalidity, but it could be symptomatic of a larger issue in that person on the day of the wedding. Secondly, yes, when we talk about someone who has the question of homosexuality is a complex one psychologically. So in the church's teaching, someone who has a same-sex attraction, that is not considered sinful. All right? To have a same-sex attraction is not considered sinful. There's lots of documents from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Whether one is homosexual or heterosexual, the obligation is the same in the church, to refrain from the use of our sexual powers in a way that does not respect their fundamental orientation, their fundamental order, which is procreative. So in the church, and that's a big question. I don't want to open that up. So in the church is teaching someone who has a same-sex attraction, that psychologically, there's the aspect psychologically of it. In terms of the marriage, it could also indicate that that person was unable to make a commitment to a heterosexual relationship, which we understand marriage to be, because it has to be open to the possibility of procreation, and that's only possible in a heterosexual relationship. So if someone does have, and it does happen that later on in life, they may realize that, then an investigation can be done, again, looking at the date of the wedding and trying to see if there was something in that person's character or personality on the date of the wedding which would make it not possible for them to make that commitment such as we understand marriage to be. And that could be something to do with homosexuality. But homosexuality in itself is not a grounds for invalidity. It would go to whether the person was able to make the type of commitment that's required for marriage. I hope that explains the nuances and the differences.
And this other question.
So this is the YouTube one. Would lying on pre-marriage protocol make that marriage invalid? And is adultery grounds for nullity of a Catholic marriage?
So two questions. If someone lies or misrepresents themselves on the preparation for marriage, the documents for marriage, that they have to fill out when they're preparing for marriage in the Catholic Church. Would that be grounds for nullity? And then secondly, in adultery. So the short answer is that on both of those grounds, no, they're not in themselves grounds for invalidity of marriage. But again, they could go towards some canonical ground that the person was unable to make on the day of the wedding the type of commitment that's required, what we call a critical exercise of their critical judgment on the day of that, of the wedding. So again, for adultery, as I said, particularly if there's a pattern of adultery, it may go to show that that person at that time on the date of that wedding was not able to make that kind of a commitment. It could be later on in life they've matured or whatever, but for that wedding, they were unable to. But adultery is not in itself a grounds for invalidity of marriage. But it can go towards showing that a person was perhaps not capable of making a marriage commitment. Again, a nuance. I hope that's clear.
Okay, thank you. So, Marlon, do you have another question?
I have another one, so I'll just share my screen again. I have put them on the slides. Here's the fourth question I received. In Alberta, can a couple be married by marriage banns? B-A-N-S.
Okay. So marriage bans, we don't use them in Alberta, or mostly in Canada. They've been dispensed with by most bishops. So, but other countries still use them. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, part of the process to determine if someone is free to marry would involve a public statement ahead of the marriage in that person's social environment, inviting people to come forward if they know that the person was previously married. And those are called marriage bans. So the way it typically worked, that would be for 3 successive Sundays, say at the public masses in the parish where the person was a parishioner for a long time, the priest would stand up and say, there is a promise of marriage between so-and-so and so-and-so. If anyone is aware why there might be an impediment to this marriage, they are asked to please come forward. So that's what we call the publication of the bans. So it's a way of getting, it was used, and it is still used in areas where it's hard to get some documentary information. So in Canada, we don't tend to use them. It's still part of the Code of Canon Law, but it's dispensed with by bishops. So the question of the person's freedom, whether they were previously married, we can get that information through access to baptismal registers and so on. So we don't require marriage bans generally in any diocese that I know of in Canada.
Part of my question was answered already. Is adultery grounds for annulment? And I hear it wasn't or isn't. Had a sacramental marriage. On the day of our wedding, I do believe we were definitely valid. And then my question is, if or when I ever remarry, what is my status in the church receiving communion? Yeah,
good question. So this is the question of Catholics who have been divorced, either remarried outside of the church or remarried outside of the church, and then access to particularly the Eucharist. And so generally, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith answered that back in the 90s. Pope Francis came in, as we sort of alluded to, with his more recent encyclical on Amoris Laetitia, chapter 6, where he dealt with that. So that's essentially a sacramental and a pastoral question. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was fairly clear that if, as long as in the second marriage, which was outside the church, the couple agreed to live as married, as brother and sister was the phrase they used. And there was no scandal, so the people in the parish wouldn't know that the person has been remarried outside the church. They could come to the sacraments.
Otherwise not?
Otherwise, not. And now Pope Francis, and this we don't, I think you'll get divergent answers if we now look to Pope Francis, because he talks about accompanying people, discerning, and what degree of integration would be possible. But those are pastoral questions to talk to with your pastor, what would be possible.
Definitely have to prove that on the day of the marriage there is an invaluable,
Yeah, we go back to the day of
Just
the
the
wedding, the day of the wedding. And as I said, all the things that happen afterwards
yeah, I understand.
can point back to a person's capacity on the day. Yeah. To whom do people speak to have a specific case reviewed prior to a full review, be it a case of form or a judicial case? Are there fees involved? So lastly, no, there are no fees involved in Canada. To whom do people speak to have a specific case reviewed? The first person to speak to would be your parish priest, who would then should be able to make the initial steps. It's also possible just to go to the website of either the Archdiocese of Edmonton or whatever diocese you're in, or the tribunal, and you'll see you just Google Interdiocesan Tribunal of Edmonton, and it'll pull up the webpage there with information, documents, the initial documents that can be filled out, and so on.
Okay. So question from the floor is, in the Archdiocese of Edmonton, what is the time frame to obtain an annulment? I've heard in some European countries it takes 2 to 5 years.
It varies quite a lot, so we don't like to put a time frame on. The cases that we tend to be getting more recently are more complex because people are moving around the world. We try to have the case concluded within a year, hopefully within 6 months. But like everything else, with COVID hitting, we had to reduce staff. We don't have the same staff that we had prior to COVID. We don't have the funds to pay that we did before. And so that has an impact on the time frames as well. So our earnest goal is to try and have it within 6 months, but that's creeping up to a year now that we've had to reduce staff. I don't think if we put it all together, we don't have a single full-time staff anymore on the tribunal. And so everybody's doing what they can do. But the other reason why an answer can't be given is that very often people aren't. So as I mentioned before, the other parties always have to be contacted. So the person comes towards us and says, "Can you look into my previous marriage?" Then we have to contact the other person. We have to find them. Sometimes it's hard to find contact information, so that can take a while. Then they have to respond. And then we have to respond to their response. We can't ignore them. So it has to be responded in a way respectful of the other party as well, and respectful of their rights as well. Then the other factor that can be very complex is language problems. So we translations. So when we do interviews, so the interviews are not necessarily in English. They can be in Spanish, or they can be in Polish, or they can be in a Chinese dialect, or they can be in different African dialects. So it take time to find someone who's available to do a translation. It can also take time in certain countries to facilitate communication. Not everybody has instantaneous communications that we're used to. So it can take a long time for people to get back to us. It can take a long time for us to contact people, say in China or certain countries. If there's a war on, Sudan has been difficult, and so on. So all of those are are variables that make it impossible to give a time frame. Each case is slightly different in that way. Best case scenario is when we are able to finish it within 6 to 8 months.
Okay, I think the next question is from Marlon.
Why, in the case of an abusive marriage, would having the children of the marriage be interviewed be of any value? This brings forth past and present trauma and causes continued and additional emotional and psychological lifelong effects. Well, first of all, we would not interview minors. There are also civil legislation regarding interviewing minors that would have to be observed. So I think your question would be, in the case of an abusive marriage, interviewing the adult children of the marriage. Now, they don't have to be interviewed. There could be other witnesses that could be brought forward. Sometimes the children don't want to because, yes, it can be a traumatic thing to go back over that time. The key is not having the children of the marriage interviewed. The key is having witnesses who can provide information about that marriage, particularly, and children tend not to be the most useful because, of course, they weren't, well, not necessarily true, but they weren't there as adults at the time of the wedding. But if there were former children from a former relationship, then they may be involved. But I mean, the children, nobody has to participate. So if the children didn't want to, they wouldn't be forced to participate. If there are other witnesses, those would be preferred.
Okay, thank you. A question is, if your ex is remarried, where are you left in the Catholic Church? So am I still considered married, and is his new marriage legitimate in the church?
So the question again, so the ex-spouse...
The ex
remarries.
Yeah, but so what happens to the person that is
Yeah.
the other half?
So the other person who remains... the person... if there was a divorce and the other person remarries, that doesn't impact the other spouse's what we call it, their sacramental aspects. Follow the usual thing. I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't receive all of the sacraments either. But it does mean that the original marriage is presumed to still be valid, even if the former spouse remarries, and so the spouse would not be able to remarry without investigation into the validity of that original marriage.
Can two people get married by using one proxy and one real partner only?
Yes, it's possible to use proxies to stand in for one of the spouses, but the law is very specific about how that goes. Very complicated, and I teach marriage law to students at Newman College, but I avoid that part because the details are very complicated about using proxies. But I'll just say it's possible, but complicated.
This question from YouTube: what is the ideal time after the end of a marriage to initiate an annulment?
Anytime. I think what the other person was saying about the trauma, I think that's very critical. Again, I want to emphasize what I'm talking about tonight is sort of the canonical aspects. But human beings are bigger than the canonical aspects. And so that varies with each individual person. So some persons find going through the process healing. Some people find it really healing. Other people find it very traumatic that they have to go through. It depends on the individual person. So there's no time frame. Some people come to us after the marriage breaks down and they're not intending to marry again. They just say, you know, I just want to know for myself. And so we can, that's possible. Other people don't come to us, and then it's very difficult. So, I mean, I've got cases where marriages that happened 40 years ago, you know, that lasted for 6 months. So that can be very, on a practical level, sort of difficult. So the time frame, there is no ideal time frame. We're human beings, and each person has to make that judgment about themselves. Very frequently, they come to us when the person is contemplating another marriage or has entered into a subsequent civil marriage. Or they've come back to the practice of the faith, or, you know, there's all sorts of reasons. So, another question from online as well. How could involving the conflictual parties, both in the required documentations and in interview, help for the same reasons above? I'm not sure what the reasons above are, so I don't have the previous question. So in a marriage case, where there is a formal judicial process, the couples all the witnesses, including the parties, are interviewed separately. All right, it's not a courtroom drama. All right, everybody gives their own testimony separately. And then once the testimonies are given and all the other witnesses' testimonies are given, then the parties have a right to read through what everybody else has said. And they have to be given the opportunity to do that. That's part of the natural right of defense. And then they can come back and respond to what they see as inaccuracies or errors by any of the evidence. So the bottom line is everybody has a right to be heard in the process. And by its nature, it is probably conflictual. But again, the two parties aren't in the same room, and it's not like a courtroom drama. Each party is interviewed separately, has a chance to tell their side of the story and to review what the other person have said and to make appropriate responses. But that's part of the natural right we have to respond to what people say about us. And there's no way in justice to avoid that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just not sure if some of these have been kind of answered. One involves someone who is married, someone who develops mental illness during the marriage, if that marriage could be annulled. And the other one is if a person marries an alcoholic, maybe this is before or during the marriage, or if they become an alcoholic after the marriage. So is there any nullity in there?
Yeah, so a mental illness is not itself a grounds for a nullity. Again, you have to show a causal link between that mental illness and the person's capacity on the day of the wedding to make an act of consent that's appropriate to the marriage relationship. And so to use some examples, yes, for instance, schizophrenia, you'd have to show that on the day of the wedding there was some impact that would negatively show that person was able to make the proper form of consent on that day. The same thing with alcoholism. Just because someone is an alcoholic doesn't mean they can never marry. It's not an impediment to marriage. You'd have to show that because of their alcoholism, they were unable to make an act of consent appropriate to marriage on that day. There was a question on the screen there. It says, I was a baptized Anglican who married a baptized Anglican. So from what we said before, that was a sacramental marriage. It's presumed to be valid. Secondly, we divorced. I remarried and was widowed. So I'm not sure if the original spouse from the first marriage is surviving or not. He remarried. I presume it's his second spouse who died. And so if the second spouse, we go back, the question there is still the very first marriage. There's a presumption that that very first marriage is still valid. During my RCIA program, so coming into the Catholic Church, a guest priest told me that my marital status as viewed by the Church was married, not living with my husband. Oh. Please explain this statement. So I think what the priest may have been saying, not very helpfully, was that the original marriage is presumed still to be married. So if that original former spouse is still alive before completing RCIA, that original marriage would have to be investigated for its validity or invalidity. That's all there is to that. The question whether you were living with the former spouse or not is irrelevant canonically.
Okay, well, it's sort of similar in a way. It says if two unbaptized persons get married in a Protestant church, then later get baptized in a Catholic church, is the marriage valid?
Yes, so two unbaptized persons marry. They were two unbaptized Protestants. So if in the Protestant churches, the two churches that they belong to, if those Protestant churches recognized their marriage while they were unbaptized, but Protestants, then that would be a valid marriage. So some Protestant churches don't have child baptism, right? Some Protestant churches also have a different view of what baptism is, and it's not required. So whatever their church accepts as a valid marriage, if those people did that as unbaptized persons, as members of those other Protestant Christian faith communities, then that would be considered, presumed to be a valid marriage. Both of them, according to the scenario, then become baptized Catholics. Then that marriage remains valid. It was valid originally, it continues to be valid. The only thing that changes is once both of the parties become baptized, it then is a sacramental marriage. Whereas before they were both unbaptized, it was a natural marriage, not a sacramental marriage. Once they become baptized, it is then a sacramental marriage, but nothing needs to be done to make it sacramental. It just is by the fact of their baptism. Another question from online. If someone has a valid marriage and proceeds with a civil divorce of this marriage, are the divorced Catholics still welcome to take communion if they haven't had a declaration of nullity of their marriage? Yes. The civil laws of divorce can be used by Catholics to regulate practical details where that common life is no longer possible. So there can be a breakdown of the relationship that's definitive. But they can say, well, we were married, it was a valid marriage, but we just can't live in the same household together for whatever reason. So there's a breakdown of the relationship, but that doesn't mean that they're precluded from receiving the sacraments. They'll want to, pastorally, it's not a canonical, there's no canonical impediment from receiving the other sacraments. Pastorally, the persons will have to deal with that breakdown of the relationship, both, on a human level, spiritually, pastorally, and so on. There may be a question of, sacramental confession, but that would be the only thing as anybody else. So the marriage broke down. Neither of them are remarried. Can they have access to communion? The answer is yes.
Are there any more questions from the floor?
Is a marriage between a baptized Catholic and a Pentecostal considered valid? I'm not sure if he is baptized. So there's two questions there. for Pentecostals, because of their understanding of baptism, you would want to see if they were baptized or not, and if their baptism was valid. So a valid baptism is someone who's baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's required for a valid baptism. And Pentecostals can vary in their form of baptism. So the diocese would have a list of which Pentecostal churches in their area have valid baptisms. So it would be just first of all, if the Catholic marries the Pentecostal who's unbaptized, they need a dispensation to marry an unbaptized person. If the Pentecostal was baptized, then they need a permission to marry the baptized Pentecostal. But in either case, you go to your parish priest and ask them to look after that. And the baptized Catholic would have to be married in the Catholic Church, the canonical form, unless they're dispensed to have the marriage in the Pentecostal Church.
I read this morning on online a CNN interview, and they talked about, because this priest or pastor, they said, used the wrong word during the baptism, all the baptisms were invalid. Is that true?
Yes, there's been a question recently where they say, we baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and that was determined by the Holy See, the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, to be an invalid baptism.
Really? So how do you correct that now?
You have to rebaptize them. Another question from online, is a civil divorce necessary before an annulment? The short answer is an unofficial and incorrect answer, but the practical one we use is yes, there has to be a civil divorce before the tribunal will consider a declaration of nullity. That's not how the Code of Canon Law sees it. The Code of Canon Law sees it that you should try and encourage the couple for reconciliation and then go ahead. But the practical reason why the tribunal will only undertake an investigation into the validity of a marriage will only do that if there's a civil divorce, is for practical reasons. That's the tribunal could actually be sued civilly for breaking up the relationship if there isn't a divorce before. So in other words, if the persons are not civilly divorced, one person comes to the tribunal and says, can you look into the nullity? Maybe the other person says, no way, we're married. And you're breaking up our relationship. You're breaking up our marriage by investigating the validity of our marriage. So the tribunal doesn't proceed. Yeah, that's not the way it's envisioned in the Code of Canon Law, but that's practically speaking the way it is.
Thank you for tonight. I have a lot of questions. I'm gonna, and hopefully it goes a little bit just beyond this. A 40-year marriage. Well, divorced for 10 years now. It would have been 4 years. I am part of the church ministry. I have not annulled my marriage, but I am looking to get married again in June, only because I have a 95-year-old mother that I want at the wedding.
Mm-hmm.
She's going to give me away. Where do I stand with the church? If I do not annul my marriage,
you cannot be married in the church.
I am part of I am the only music ministry we have.
Yeah, I mean...
What can I do?
Yeah, just talk to your pastor and figure out what... I mean, that happens a lot. We have non-Catholics in music ministry. I think, I'm not sure what the archdiocesan policy, you'd have to talk to your pastor, but probably it's a little more problematic if someone's distributing communion.
Oh, yeah. No.
That's I think, I'm not up on that, but in terms of music ministry and so...
Can I receive communion?
You'd have to talk to your pastor, but the short answer, initial answer is no. Yeah. But you'd have to talk to your pastor to see.
Can I have a funeral?
Yes, absolutely.
In a Catholic church, my funeral.
Yes.
what was the other one? I have lots of questions, but they're like all short answer ones like that.
I think the important thing to try and that we grapple with is we're never not part of the church. The question is, how does my participation in the church look, right? But that's true for everybody. We all go through periods of life when it's hard, right? And it's hard to be a member of the church for different reasons, have nothing to do with marriages. Marriage happens to be one where there's sort of more, you might say, a little more clarity about some of those things, but the underlying reality is the same. We're human beings, we're complex. We're trying to observe what Christ asks of us as best we can in the situation we find ourselves. What that looks like at any particular time varies for all of us, even if the externals look like, wow, I'm really involved in the church, right? My head might be saying, I'm just here because I've always been here and I'm struggling with it. And, there's no legal answer to that. That's a pastoral and a spiritual kind of an answer. And that's the deeper and more important aspect, I would have to say.
One last question, and you may have answered this and I may just have missed it. Can you annul a marriage after your first marriage, after a second marriage?
Yes, that happens fairly frequently. So, to give you another scenario, you'll have someone who fell away from the church. They were married, fell away from the church, divorced, civilly remarried. Maybe later on comes back and says, maybe I need to have this. Yeah, there's absolutely no problem with that.
Okay, one more question I forgot. If I am marrying a Presbyterian baptized Presbyterian, do both of us have to get our marriages annulled? Or just me as the Catholic?
No, they would also have to.
Yeah,
because,
both of us have. Yeah. No matter where you go in, both of you have to have
and
your marriage annulled.
That's one of the difficulties. So where a baptized Catholic wants to marry a baptized non-Catholic, an Anglican or and the Anglican was married to a previous Anglican. So they're civilly divorced. Now they want to marry a Catholic. So the tribunal actually has to do the investigation into the marriage between the two Anglicans, right? Which is a delicate thing, that's a hard thing to say, because it's sort of like, well, why is the Catholic Church sticking its nose in my previous marriage, right? That was in the Anglican Church. Again, it gets back to what we said at the beginning about what our understanding of what marriage is. That marriage, in some way, we use that word as the author of marriage is God. And it doesn't matter whether the person was baptized or unbaptized or not. That the presumption that the marriage was valid will be the same whether they were Catholics or not Catholics. And the tools that the tribunal uses are going to be the same that would be the tools in the natural law. So to use a concrete example, if two Anglicans, an Anglican got married to an unbaptized person, all right? When the Catholic Church investigates that marriage, it's not going to apply the Catholic criteria that the Anglican had to get a dispensation from the Anglican Church to marry the unbaptized person, unless the Anglican Church requires that of their own members. Okay, well, that's kind of getting down the road, but yeah.
All right, I think this question came up, the one that's on the Google Meet. Is a civic divorce necessary for an annulment? I think you just answered that.
Yes, I answered that. Yes, so, for practical reasons, there has to be a civil divorce before.
There's one from YouTube. I think we are probably going to have to be that's the right time over there, but that's a little after 9. So I guess this is, I'm going to take this question, and I'm going to take the one on Google, and I think that will be it. So, okay, I'll do this one. What type of proof of psychological evidence, for example, fear, impending marital consent, can be presented to the tribunal witnesses? May not be privy to, or witnesses may not be privy to such a condition. And how can I still be considered married in the eyes of the church when my ex is remarried? I think, oh yeah, I don't know if we answered that one.
Yeah, to answer the second question, because your original marriage is still presumed to be the valid marriage, and the second marriage of your ex-spouse was invalid for reason of the prior bond. So you're still considered married to the original spouse. There's no reason on your part that that doesn't change your status or access to the sacraments as such, because you're not the one who has remarried civilly after the divorce. Sorry, the other question was?
What type of proof of psychological
yeah.
evidence for
That's,
fear?
Yeah, the proof, what type of psychological evidence is looked at by a tribunal? That's a good question. It's also a complex question. It has to go to types of evidence, practical questions. So typically, though, we take the witness testimony of the person themselves. It is possible for us to, if with the appropriate consents, to request a report from a psychologist or a medical doctor. However, with the current state of privacy laws, at least in the province of Alberta, most psychologists will not give us a report, even if their client has signed a consent release. So it's very, very, very hard for the tribunal to get psychological evidence from a practitioner for the reasons of the privacy law. And so we generally have to go on the testimony of the person themselves. Sometimes they summarize what their psychologist or psychiatrist or doctor has said. And yes, other witnesses won't be able to give the same testimony of what was happened, but sometimes the other testimony, without explicitly giving testimony about the medical condition of the person, by their observations of the behaviors of the other person, does go some ways to corroborate what the person is saying they were going through at that time in terms of psychological trauma and so on. So yes, our tools are very limited in that sense to get medical evidence, and so we're quite hindered in that. Again, the process is not perfect. We can only take the testimony that's given to us, try and weigh it up as best we can. And the judges, they read a lot of these cases. They can sort of tell when someone's, there are times when people try and, I don't know how to put that, you can tell they're sort of manipulating things. So that usually comes through fairly clearly in the evidence one way or another. So those are very practical problems of the quality and the source of evidence, which are difficult and complex questions. Can we get written comments on marriage from your ex before the annulment? Oh yes, certainly. In fact, Pope Francis has instituted what they call the briefer form of the marriage process, where both parties are sort of in agreement, and they put forward what we would call in civil law an agreed statement of facts. And so both parties are involved. Both parties agreed on the basic fact scenario of their marriage, and so that's possible. So there's nothing preventing the two couples, from speaking to one another before and getting written comments. And sometimes, for instance, we'll get a party, the other party doesn't want to be interviewed, but they will submit written submissions, and that's permissible. The value, just the judges will weigh the value of it, but it's possible that sometimes they do that. So that's possible as well.
Well, thank you so much for that, Father Philip. So I'm thinking that's will be it for the evening. I thank all of you for coming. And if anybody isn't quite sure and they've got more questions or weren't sure your question was answered, we have it on YouTube now, so anybody can go back to the YouTube program and go through it and relive it again if they aren't quite sure and they can't quite remember all of the answers to all of the questions. A lot of questions for you, a lot of them not easy to answer. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Diocesan CWL and St. Teresa Parish, and thank all of you for coming, and I hope you have a safe trip home. Maybe, Father, you could give us a blessing before we go?
Sure.
Sorry, Annette. There's a lady who's been raising her hand here. Just wanna.
Oh, okay. Well,
Regina is before we.
one last question, Marlon. One last.
Regina, do you hear me? You can unmute and raise your question. Thank you.
You know what? I'm sorry. I actually put my question in the chat, and so it was responded to. I guess I just didn't put my hand down. But
Okay. Thank you. That's good then.
Thank you
All
for
right.
that. All right.
Well, just a word of thanks to all of you. And again, anything that touches on marriage is important, and it's significant, not just in the life of the church, but it's significant in the individual lives of human beings. And the church's law tries to take and put together what the church understand historically about what marriage is, understanding that it's a very difficult state of life, but it is the vocation, as I said at the beginning, that is the most common vocation of the faithful. And so it's not surprising that it gives rise to lots of consternation and questions, and particularly in our own day with our own culture. It can be very difficult to understand the church's, what we would say, perennial teaching on marriage. And so, if this has been helpful in some way or other, I'm sure there's still many more questions and difficulties. And again, what we're dealing with this evening is more of the legal side, but it would be a sad day if we left people with just a legal aspect to the marriage. As I said, we are human beings. A marriage is not simply a legal structure. It's a human structure, and being human beings, it's part of the intimate aspect of our lives, and so it requires a constant need to come back to essentials about what we believe, our role in creation, and so on. And so thank you for the opportunity, and I hope in some way this was a little helpful to those who have been listening. Thank you. And I'll just give you a blessing then to conclude, and may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit descend upon you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Father, where are you from in Saskatchewan?
I'll get up now.
Where are you from in Saskatchewan? Oh my gosh, I'm from Hudson Bay.
Hudson Bay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was born in Melfort, and I moved away when I was 5. Montreal, then we moved to Calgary. Now,